Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. They say history repeats itself, but honestly, I'm just hoping I can remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Luckily, we've got an expert on board who doesn't have that problem, especially when it comes to the brilliant minds who shaped American history.
Well, hopefully remembering breakfast is a lower bar than, say, comprehending the complexities of James Madison's political philosophy.
That's Kami, and I'm Hari and Kimi. You sent us a trove of information on James Madison, and we're excited to take a deep dive beyond the textbook basics and really unpack the man, his ideas, and his impact on the nation.
It's fascinating because when you dig deeper, you realize that Madison's journey wasn't the typical path of a founding father here. He was born in 1751 into a wealthy Virginia planter family, the eldest of 12 children surrounded by privileged land and, unfortunately, slaves, not exactly the image that screams revolutionary, right?
You'd think he'd be perfectly content following the well-trodden path of a Virginia gentleman. But Madison was a man of contradictions. He grappled with fragile health throughout his life, a fact that makes his intellectual and political fortitude all the more remarkable. And instead of attending the College of William and Mary like many of his peers, he chose Princeton, then known as the College of New Jersey, perhaps hinting at an independent streak that would define his career.
It's at Princeton that he encounters a figure who would profoundly shape his thinking. John Witherspoon, a Scottish Presbyterian minister, and a leading light of the Enlightenment Witherspoon, instilled in Madison the principles of republicanism, individual liberty, and limited government values that would become the bedrock of his entire political philosophy.
Which is interesting because despite his strong convictions against British overreach, Madison didn't immediately jump into the fray of the American Revolution. You might expect someone so passionate about liberty to be on the front lines, but this speaks to a different side of him.
Exactly. He wasn't a soldier charging into battle. He was a thinker, a strategist. His battleground was the legislature, the convention hall, the world of ideas where he could wield his intellect like a weapon he believed in, fighting for change through reasoned debate and careful maneuvering.
And this commitment to liberty gets even more complicated when you consider his relationship with slavery in 1783, right after the Revolution. One of his slaves in Ockley, Billy, was nearly freed to avoid a rebellion. Talk about a complicated situation. Eventually, Billy did gain his freedom and took on the name William Gardner, even becoming a shipping agent for Madison.
That detail really underscores the moral contradictions that plagued not just Madison, but the entire nation during this era here. Was a man passionately advocating for liberty while simultaneously entangled in a system that denied it to so many. It forces us to grapple with the complexities of history and recognize that even those we revere were products of their time.
So let's trace his early political career. We see him in the Virginia House of Delegates, a young but determined delegate, fighting for religious freedom, pushing for the separation of church and state. He even persuaded Thomas Jefferson to strengthen the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This guy was a powerhouse from the start.
And it's in the Continental Congress during the turbulent years after the Revolution that his frustration with the Articles of Confederation grows. The newly formed nation was barely held together by this weak central government, incapable of effectively addressing the challenges facing the young republic.
Which is what ultimately led him to become one of the key figures pushing for a new constitutional convention. He wasn't just there to observe or offer suggestions. He arrived with a blueprint for a bolder, more robust government.
He certainly did, armed with the Virginia Plan. Madison set the stage for a contentious but ultimately transformative debate, while not all of his proposals were adopted. His ideas about separation of powers, checks and balances, and a strong yet limited federal government were nothing short of revolutionary.
It's fascinating how he wasn't just a brilliant theorist. He also possessed incredible political acumen, skillfully navigating the tensions between large and small states during the convention. The Great Compromise, although not his brainchild, wouldn't have been possible without his deft negotiation and coalition building.
The Great Compromise was a testament to his understanding that progress often requires finding common ground, even amidst deeply held differences. This agreement, establishing the bicameral legislature we know today, with a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate where each state has equal representation, was a linchpin for the Constitution's adoption.
And then he teams up with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to write the Federalist Papers, a series of essays defending the newly drafted Constitution. Imagine having the foresight and intellectual prowess to not only craft a groundbreaking framework for government, but also to eloquently articulate its principles for the public's consideration.
The impact of those essays, particularly Madison's contributions like Federalist Number 10 and Number 51, is still felt today. They remain essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the foundations of American political thought. and offer enduring insights into the dangers of factions, the need for checks and balances, and the delicate balance between liberty and order.
So we've seen him go from a sickly but intellectually gifted kid to a Revolutionary-era leader and finally to the architect of the Constitution, all before the age of 40. It's an incredible trajectory. But as we move into Madison's presidency in later years, the complexities of his legacy come even more sharply into focus. Are you ready to delve into the triumphs and tribulations of the Madison presidency?
Absolutely. There's so much more to uncover as we explore how the father of the Constitution navigated the realities of governing a young nation facing immense challenges both domestically and on the world stage.
We left off with James Madison stepping into the presidency, taking the reins from his friend and predecessor Thomas Jefferson. But to mention, it wasn't all smooth sailing from there.
It certainly wasn't a seamless transition. Even as Madison assumed the presidency in 1808, there were already fissures within his own Democratic-Republican Party, and the international political landscape was a powder keg waiting to explode.
He inherited a precarious situation with escalating tensions between the United States and the two European powerhouses of the day. Great Britain and France, both countries, were engaging in aggressive maritime practices, seizing American ships and impressing sailors into their navies, essentially forcing them into service against their will.
Imagine being caught between a rock and a hard place. That was Madison's predicament as he tried to navigate this diplomatic nightmare. He was a staunch advocate for American neutrality, but with both Britain and France encroaching on U.S. sovereignty, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that stance.
And in a bid to avoid outright war, he initially tried to exert economic pressure through the Embargo Act of 1807, hoping to cripple Britain and France by cutting off trade. The idea was that hitting them in the pocketbook would force them to respect American neutrality, but as we know, it didn't exactly play out as planned.
The Embargo Act, while conceived with noble intentions, revealed a certain naivete about the complexities of global trade and the unpredictable nature of international relations. It backfired spectacularly, dealing a heavy blow to the American economy, particularly in New England, a region deeply reliant on maritime commerce, and ultimately failed to achieve its intended goal of coercing Britain and France into changing their behavior.
It was a harsh lesson in the limitations of economic statecraft, and one that severely damaged Madison's popularity despite his best efforts to maintain peace. The situation continued to deteriorate, and the drums of war grew louder, fueled by the so-called war hawks in Congress, who saw this as an opportunity to finally break free from Britain's lingering influence and assert American dominance on the world stage.
These war hawks, primarily from the South and West, were eager to expand American territory and influence for life. They viewed the war as a chance to seize Canada from the British and solidify American control over the North American continent. There was a sense of national pride and a belief that the young nation needed to prove its strength and independence on the battlefield.
And so, despite neither side truly desiring a full-blown conflict, the United States found itself dragged into the War of 1812, a war that would test the nation's resilience and expose both its vulnerabilities and its unexpected strengths.
The early stages of the war were a sobering reality check for the United States. American forces were ill-prepared and poorly equipped to face the might of the British Empire. The British Navy, with its superior firepower and experience, dominated the seas, and the British Army inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on American soil.
The most devastating blow came in 1814, when British forces marched into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the Capitol building. The White House and other government buildings imagined the shock and humiliation of seeing the nation's capital in flames.
It was a symbolic victory for the British, demonstrating their ability to strike at the heart of American power. But amidst the chaos and destruction, there emerged a glimmer of hope and resilience. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, bravely refused to flee until she had secured important historical artifacts, including the iconic portrait of George Washington, saving them from the encroaching flames.
Her actions became a testament to the spirit of defiance that would ultimately help the nation rally and overcome these early setbacks. It's fascinating how, even in the darkest moments, individuals can rise to the occasion and inspire those around them.
It's a reminder that history is shaped not just by grand strategies and sweeping battles, but also by acts of courage and determination from individuals who choose to stand their ground. And while the burning of Washington was a significant setback, it ultimately fueled a surge of American patriotism and a determination to turn the tide of the war.
And turn the tide they did despite the early setbacks. The U.S. began to score some crucial victories, both on land and at sea. The USS Constitution, affectionately known as Old Ironsides, became a symbol of American naval prowess, defeating British warships and capturing the imagination of the public.
The naval victories were a major turning point, boosting morale and demonstrating that the United States could hold its own against the most formidable naval power in the world. And then there was the pivotal Battle of Baltimore, where American forces successfully repelled a British attack, an event that inspired Francis Scott Key to pen the words that would become our national anthem. The Star-Spangled Banner, a stirring testament to American resilience in the face of adversity.
These victories, coupled with Britain's growing war fatigue and changing priorities in Europe, led to the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814, officially ending the War of 1812, while technically a stalemate with neither side achieving a decisive victory. The war had a profound impact on the United States, both domestically and internationally.
The timing of the treaty signing created a peculiar situation. News traveled slowly back then, and before word of the peace agreement reached American shores, a final battle took place in New Orleans, and it was a resounding American victory led by the charismatic General Andrew Jackson. American forces inflicted heavy casualties on the British, turning Jackson into a national hero and solidifying the perception of American triumph.
It's amazing how the perception of victory, even in a war that was essentially a draw, can shape a nation's narrative and redefine its place in the world. The War of 1812, despite its messy and inconclusive nature, ultimately forged a stronger sense of national unity and propelled the United States onto the path of becoming a major player on the global stage.
The war had a profound impact on Madison's thinking as well. Having witnessed the limitations of a weak central government firsthand, he emerged from the conflict with a newfound appreciation for the need for a more robust federal government capable of effectively addressing national challenges.
So the father of the Constitution, who had initially been a champion of limited government, found himself embracing a more Hamiltonian approach, advocating for policies like a national bank protective tariffs and federal funding for internal improvements policies he had once opposed.
It was a remarkable evolution for a man who had dedicated his life to defining the boundaries of federal power. The War of 1812 had forced him to confront the realities of governing a nation in a turbulent world, and he adapted his thinking to meet the demands of the time.
But while the war may have solidified the nation's standing on the world stage, it also exacerbated existing tensions within its borders, particularly when it came to westward expansion and its impact on Native American tribes.
You're absolutely right. Madison's presidency, despite its successes in navigating the complexities of war and diplomacy, also saw the continuation of policies that dispossessed Native Americans of their land and violated treaties despite acknowledging the government's duty to civilize Native Americans. His administration oversaw the acquisition of millions of acres of indigenous land through treaties, often treaties signed under duress or outright fraudulent.
The very war that was partly fueled by the desire to expand westward ultimately resulted in further displacement and hardship for many Native American communities. It's a tragic chapter in American history that continues to cast a shadow on the legacy of westward expansion and the nation's treatment of its indigenous peoples.
It's a stark reminder that progress for one group often came at the expense of others. And as we delve into Madison's post-presidency years, we'll see how this tension between his commitment to liberty and his complicity in a system that denied it to so many continues to shape his legacy. Are you ready to explore the final chapter of Madison's life?
Absolutely. Let's see what insights await us as we delve into Madison's retirement years and the complex legacy he left behind. Welcome back. It's hard to imagine having the energy to do much of anything after serving 2 terms as president. But James Madison didn't exactly ride off into the sunset and call it a day.
Retirement for a figure like Madison wasn't about slipping into obscurity in 1817 at the age of 65. He returned to Montpelier, his Virginia plantation, but he faced a rather unexpected challenge: financial strain.
You'd think the father of the Constitution would be set for life. But it turns out that public service doesn't always come with a hefty pension plan.
He was never a particularly wealthy man to begin with, and the declining price of tobacco, coupled with some questionable financial management by his stepson, John Payne, Todd put a strain on his estate, but financial woes didn't stop him from engaging in public life.
So he wasn't exactly sitting on the porch sipping lemonade and reminiscing about the good old days. What did he do to keep busy? Did he offer unsolicited advice to the new generation of politicians?
Well, maybe a little unsolicited advice here and there, particularly to Andrew Jackson, who was a rising force in American politics. But Madison's primary focus turned to something that had always been close to his heart: education. He became the second rector of the University of Virginia after Thomas Jefferson's death in 1826, a fitting role for a man who believed so deeply in the power of knowledge and enlightened citizenry.
Education was something he championed throughout his life. It makes you wonder what he would think of the state of education today. But even in his later years, the issues that had haunted him throughout his career, the institution of slavery, continued to weigh heavily on his conscience.
Despite his deep involvement in crafting a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and equality, Madison, like many of his contemporaries, remained deeply entangled in the web of slavery. He continued to grapple with this moral dilemma, advocating for gradual emancipation and exploring the controversial idea of colonization.
Colonization, the concept of sending freed slaves to Africa, was a popular idea at the time, but it seemed so deeply flawed and inherently unjust. How did Madison reconcile this approach with his own principles?
It's a question that historians continue to debate. Madison's support for colonization stemmed from a belief that it was the most pragmatic solution to a deeply entrenched problem. He believed that racial prejudice was so deeply ingrained in American society that true integration was impossible. Colonization, in his view, offered a way to provide freed slaves with a fresh start in a land where they could govern themselves and build a new society free from the shackles of oppression.
It's a solution that reflects the limitations of his time, a time when racial equality was a distant and seemingly unattainable ideal for many. It's difficult to reconcile this aspect of his thinking with the brilliance he displayed in crafting a system of government dedicated to liberty.
Madison, despite his intellectual brilliance and dedication to democratic principles, was a product of his environment. He operated within a system built on racial hierarchy and deeply ingrained prejudices. It's a reminder that even those we revere as visionaries and champions of liberty can be blind to the full implications of their ideals and fall short of the very principles they espouse.
So, as Madison's health declined, he entered his twilight years, becoming one of the last surviving members of that remarkable generation of founders who had dared to imagine and create a new nation. He passed away in 1836 at the age of 85, leaving behind a legacy both monumental and complex.
What's intriguing is that in his final years, Madison became increasingly concerned with shaping his historical image. He meticulously reviewed and edited his letters and documents, perhaps recognizing that history is often written by the victors and wanting to ensure that his contributions were remembered in a favorable light.
It's human nature to want to control how we're perceived, especially when you've played such a pivotal role on the world stage. But regardless of his efforts to curate his own narrative, James Madison's legacy remains a tapestry woven with threads of brilliance and contradiction.
He's hailed as the father of the Constitution, the architect of a system of government that has endured for centuries, a champion of liberty and Republican ideals. But he was also a man who inherited and benefited from a system built on the exploitation of enslaved Africans, a system he never fully renounced.
It's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy. The figures we study, even those we celebrate as heroes, were complex individuals grappling with moral dilemmas and navigating a world rife with contradictions. Their legacies are often a mix of triumph and tragedy, of progress and complicity.
And perhaps that's the most important takeaway from our deep dive into the life of James Madison. We can't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, the complexities, the inconsistencies that make up the human experience. It's in wrestling with these contradictions that we gain a deeper understanding not just of the past, but of ourselves and the challenges we face today.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the life and legacy of James Madison, the question that lingers is, how do we as individuals and as a nation continue to strive towards the ideals of liberty and equality that he so eloquently articulated, while also acknowledging and confronting the ways in which we continue to fall short of those ideals?
It's a question worth pondering, a question that challenges us to critically examine our own beliefs and actions and to work towards building a more just and equitable society that truly lives up to the principles upon which it was founded. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And thank you for listening.